Our next panel is process focus, process equals policy, and we're excited about it because it's something, an area of topic in DC that gets far too little conversation. The longest serving congressman in history, John Dingell, once said, "If you let me write procedure and I let you write substance, I'll beat you every time." He didn't use the word beat, he used a more colorful word. But what he was getting at is that often policy outcomes are dictated by procedural decisions along the way. Unfortunately, for far too long, the leadership in both houses perpetuate a meme that goes along the lines of, if I let you, I'm going to go ahead and let you vote your district on policy, but on procedural matters, I want you to go ahead and vote with the team. So on all these procedural matters that set up policy votes, you end up by voting with the team against your policy ambitions. And let me give you an example. For every major bill, there is a specific House rule, a special rule that overrides all of the other House rules and sets up a procedure just for that bill. How many amendments, how long is the debate? That bill that they're about to consider may violate a budget on how much you can spend for the given year, and what they will do is they will actually waive in the procedural rule the budget for that bill. And so a member thinks, I'm just voting for a procedural rule here, and next thing they know, they have violated their principles on supporting policy that they don't support. So at Heritage Action, we believe that process is policy, and that in as much as members should have a say in making sure their voting card is used to represent their constituents when it comes to sound policy, we also think that they need to take a close look at understanding how they are voting on procedural matters and to really understand the procedure that is going on in both the House and the Senate. And so that brings us to the current panel. We have two great speakers, and I'll go ahead and introduce both of them, who will give us a different vantage point, one for the House and one for the Senate. David McIntosh served 3 terms from Indiana. He was the former chairman of the Republican Study Committee, also was chairman of the CATS, which was really kind of the HFC within the RSC at that time. And now he is the head of the Club for Growth, and he has a great perspective because he was part of the revolutionary class of '94, and so he'll be able to give you a sense for how did that class treat procedure vis-a-vis policy. Ed Corrigan is now our group vice president here at Heritage Foundation. For a long time, he was the executive director of the Senate Steering Committee. When I was the executive director of the Republican Study Committee, he and I were counterparts and partners in crime. He has a real understanding of how the Senate works, and we're excited to hear from them both. We will do the standard format where they will provide comments, then we'll get into a little bit of a discussion amongst ourselves, and then open it hopefully for questions if we can get to that. So with that, let's go to David McIntosh.
Thank you, Russ. Great to be here. Glad that you all are staying for the presentation on process. It's dry, or can be dry, because it's not about how do you reform government, reduce the size of it, cut spending, lower taxes. But in the end, if that's our agenda, we need to know the process in order to have a Congress that will successfully do that. One of the problems that has really grown over the last 5 or 6 years, started actually probably 10 years ago in the Republican-run Congress, is that they gradually, as they matured in the leadership, so more years in the majority, more and more frequently would use process to stifle debate and to eliminate conservative options on a lot of these bills. The Democrats had been infamous at that. So when I came in 1994, we were a reform Congress. Newt Gingrich ran and led that campaign, was the speaker. Part of the promises in the club, or the contract with America, were that we would have an open process. We'd apply the legislation that we passed for everybody else to Congress. So there were a lot of internal reforms. One of those was that people would be given a chance to debate amendments, and there would be open and fair rules. Now, even in the 6 years I was there, as we got further and further away from that '94 election where we championed an open and fair process, the temptation to use the rules in order to accomplish a result that may not reflect what the people's will is, was greater and greater. So there came a couple times where we had to, as the precursor to the Republican Study Committee, called the CATS, Conservative Action Team, decided and organized an opposition to the rule. That preliminary vote, I can tell you more than once we were taken to the woodshed where as the rule is open and you see the clock being held open because there aren't enough votes to pass it, were a dozen of us sitting in a room off the Capitol being yelled at by the collective leadership that we absolutely had to do this. A couple times they convinced us not to take it down, but a couple times we took the rule down. And then what happened next was leadership realized they had to negotiate with the conservatives and change the bill in order to get the votes needed to move it forward. So it's a very useful tool. What's happened more recently is, particularly under John Boehner's leadership as Speaker, the ethic developed that you were a disloyal Republican if you ever considered to vote against the rule. They even began stripping people from their committee assignments, punishing them in terms of availability of having the Republican political committee support them in their reelection, and use the powers that leadership had to discipline members that took those rule votes. I think it's very important that we, as a philosophical matter, encourage members not to accede to that. That in a way, they're giving up half of their voting card, as Russ pointed out in that quote by John Dingell, the important half in terms of determining what the outcome is, if they let the leadership insist that they always vote for the leadership rule. By the way, the Rules Committee, something we're all familiar with, there is a reason the Speaker gets to appoint 9 of the 12 members of the Rules Committee, a supermajority, and can easily take people off, determine who's chairman. He runs that committee. He's not a member, but the Speaker is the one that ultimately makes the call of what that process will look like. It's the way that the House functions to have the majority will prevail, and is through that Rules Committee process. It works well when their job is sorting through all the amendments, prioritizing them, and coming up with a structured rule. Or in the case of appropriations bills, the tradition we had was it was the so-called open rule. You keep having amendments on the floor until everybody's done. That created the burden for the committees to defend their bills and created the opportunity for conservatives to come down. And some of you remember Tom Coburn. He was one of our House members at the time, and he and John Shattuck and I and several other people would come down with each of us a couple amendments on an appropriations bill. And after a few days, the chairman was calling up Tom Coburn and saying, what do you really need to change in this bill to stop the amendment process? So it's important that we return to that tradition of having an open process so conservatives can have their day in court and their opportunity to take these to the floor. But most important is to get members to realize it's part of their duty as a member of Congress to be able to vote their conscience, to vote their home district's will on the rules vote. And if they're being asked to vote for one that determines an outcome that they don't agree with, they need to have the freedom to vote no on those rules. It's gotten even worse in more recent times because the rule would be structured where the bill that you ultimately voted on may be motherhood and apple pie, and the rule says, well, we'll have a vote on that. We'll have 3 amendments. Do you want apple pie, cherry pie, or pecan pie? But at the end of the day, when that passes, we're automatically adding a tax increase or some other bill that nobody would vote for. So the rule becomes a substantive vote, clearly in that case, and has to be voted on, and people should be held accountable for how their votes are in those type of substantive rules. I think Paul Ryan has agreed not to do that. It was one of the reforms that the Freedom Caucus insisted on when they agreed to vote for him for Speaker. The pressure will be enormous as he gets to an outcome that he's agreed to in negotiations with Pelosi and Reid and the President that is unpopular and not one that Republicans want to vote for. So we'll have to hold his feet to the fire to make sure that they don't return to that type of duplicitous process. By the way, if I can give you a 2-second digression, at the Club for Growth, we rate people and how they vote, and Heritage Action does as well. We typically have not rated these process votes on the rules, but now we're looking at that and rethinking our strategy, particularly in these cases where the rule determines the outcome, to make that one of the votes we rate in determining what score they get on the Club for Growth scorecard, which then has consequences because our mission with our affiliated PAC is to run campaigns against the men and women who have terrible scores. So we've got a chance now to put some muscle behind this philosophy of actually making the rules votes count. There are several other things that in the process our guys should learn to do. You've got to start these battles in committee. So use your committee assignments, bring forward amendments, negotiate on that, insist on conservative witnesses in the bill, in the oversight and in the committee. Learn the rules book. If you master the rules on the floor, you can also have a great impact on the substance of it. And continue to work as a group. To be effective in using a process vote, you've got to have at least 40 members that you agree with. That's the margin of Republicans it takes to not vote for something in order for it not to pass. You also have to make sure that they don't have the opportunity to go and get the Democrats to fill in the extra votes. So typically, like when we would do it, one of the issues I remember we fought them on the rule was stopping the Mexico City policy, which, if you remember, was a abortion policy that the Clinton administration had put into place and reversed Bush and Reagan on. We wanted to use the appropriations process to change that back. The leadership didn't want to fight the fight, and so they let the bill go through without an amendment on that. And we knew that if we defeated that rule on the grounds that they would return to Mexico City policy of being a pro-life position, none of the Democrats would vote with them. So we were strategic in picking the bills that we had the rules fight on to show them that we could beat them with, in that case, it was about 20 Republicans, and they couldn't fill in any of those votes with a Democratic vote. So you have to be strategic when you engage in these process battles. You have to keep in mind what it is you're trying to accomplish. We learned some other hard lessons. I remember another issue where we fought and we actually got our provision into the bill. And I don't know if any of you remember Mike Castle, who was a very liberal member from Delaware. He smiled and said, sure, I can agree with that. 2 weeks later, we figured out why he was smiling, and that's because he knew the deal was in that they would drop our provision in the conference with the Senate. So you've got to be strategic and think through all of the ways that they can use the process to defeat what you're trying to do. But it's important to accomplish the change in direction. Ultimately, what we want to do is increase the number of members who agree with us so that the leadership we're not having to battle with them, we're only having to battle with the liberal Democrats, and they're with us in fighting these battles to get better legislation through. With that, I'll turn back the mic.
Great. Ed?
So Trent Lott famously tells the story about when he first came to the Senate, and he asked the parliamentarian, said, I want to learn the rules. And the parliamentarian sat him down and said, Senator, there are really only 2 rules in the Senate, exhaustion and unanimous consent. And he said the second one only happens after the first one has been achieved. And so really that's the first thing to know about the Senate. It's important to learn the rules. They're often, every time the Senate rules are described in news articles, they call them Byzantine and arcane and so forth. They're really not. There's probably about 3 or 4 pages in the Senate rules that mean anything. But what it really informs, knowledge of the rules and knowing how to use them, really only informs what you put a hold on. The hold is the power that a senator can use to be to ask to be consulted on a unanimous consent agreement. The Senate does so much by unanimous consent. They're really, to contrast it against the House, really there's 2 rules in Congress. The Senate's unanimous consent and the House is the Speaker. And so basically you have those 2 rules in contrast where you have a more autocratic body and a more diffuse body. And so what I think what we've seen is how can this process be used for the advantage of conservatism. And over the years, the Senate has been a place where Russ mentioned how when we were both counterparts, Russ was with the Republican Study Committee in the House, and I was at the Steering Committee in the Senate. Frequently, we were on speed dial together, and Russ would call me up. Some bill just kind of got through the House, and he'd say, "You guys got to slow this thing down." That's typically the way things will happen. Things will get through the House because they can. The rules are much more easy to do, but it's an opportunity, though, working together in a bicameral collaborative way, that you say, okay, well, this bill really is not advancing conservative principles and should be slowed down. Maybe sometimes it's just to add an amendment, or maybe sometimes it's actually because the policy in the bill is bad. But when you really think about the way that the town is set up, the way the Congress is set up, the way the committee structures are set up, the way the incentives are, it's really set up and designed to grow and expand big government. And so what we need to understand is it doesn't matter who's in control. The system is designed to create a more expansive government growing program. It's not set up to dismantle and repeal laws and cut spending. So the hold and they call it the filibuster, is an important part of the legislative process. Founders called it the cooling saucer, but it is. I'll give you an example of when I first. So I worked for the steering committee for 10 years. My first 4 were under Senator Sessions of Alabama. In 2006, after the Republicans had just gotten shellacked in the election, it was over earmarks, culture of corruption. There was a lot of themes the Democrats were using that year. And so we came back into the lame duck Congress, and we immediately went back to business as usual. And a bill with the military construction bill was on the floor, and they started cranking more earmarks through. And I was like, wow, this is somebody doesn't get what just happened here. And I went up and talked to Senator DeMint, my new boss. Had literally just gotten hired from him. He took over the steering committee, and said, what should we do about this? And he said, well, let's try and slow it down. And so what happened was this bill was going to carry the 10,000 earmark omni that they had saved for the lame duck Congress. And so the only way we could stop the omni was from blocking it. Congressman McIntosh mentioned the conference committee. Blocking that from going to the conference committee would stop them from airdropping in these 10,000 earmarks. And so the only thing DeMint had to do was put a hold on it. And the hold, which is an objection to a unanimous consent agreement in the Senate, is really the right of any senator. And so it's gotten a bad rap, but really all it is says, I don't agree with this, and I'm not going to agree to the unanimous consent. And they needed unanimous consent to get that bill into conference. The Republicans said, well, we need to pass this bill now, or we're not going to get our 10,000 earmarks, and the Democrats will take over, and then they'll get earmarks to their districts and not ours. DeMint held strong. We had a couple of tense meetings where he was called into the leader's office, and some of the members were not happy with him. We didn't do the bill that year. We went back, and the Democrats passed the bill the following year and didn't do any earmarks. And so it actually was an opportunity where process actually produced policy, even though it was, we obviously you'd prefer to do the bill under Republican control. At the time, it would not have served to our benefit. But it was one senator standing in the line of fire and saying, "I'm not going to let this bill to go to conference." So it's important to know about some of these rules and to learn about that. We're going to have a talk about the filibuster later and what that means, and Senator Lee will be able to give a little more flavor to that. But I think it's just important that that conservatives always look at process is a tool by which we advance our principles and our policies. We shouldn't necessarily look at some process is the end. The process is the means to achieve the end. And so I think that's the way I would look at it.
We don't have much time for the back and forth, so I'm going to ask you all to clip your answers if possible, but I want to get at some of the things that are in the news. Members talk all the time about regular order. What does regular order mean to either of you, and what is the right way to do regular order, and what's the wrong way to do regular order?
So The most recent example where they talk about regular order is with respect to the appropriations process. That has probably more meaning for the Senate than the House, because the Senate the rules are more cumbersome. Unanimous consent's important. The cloture rules, how you end a debate on a bill, it takes time. It takes probably a week to do an appropriations bill. So the question is, should we do these bills individually? I think most members who would want to have a chance to review the bills and see them do not like the current process. And I don't think any of us like the current process where a bill is put online, at 11 p.m., and then the next day it's voted on. What we want is a process where there's transparency and opportunity for amendment. Whether that's 12 bills, 3 bills, 1 bill, or whatever, I think, again, our goal is to get good policy. The process is the means to the end. Getting 12 bills is not an end goal. It is a means to an end, which is shrinking government and achieving more transparency and more and better government conservative principles. So I don't, as much as I don't like the current policy, I also don't necessarily say that I would see 12 bills as some kind of solution to all of life's problems. We did used to do 12 bills every year. I think the last time we did it was '98, and the process wasn't pretty. It was, earmarks and cajoling and lots of, basically the other thing is in the Senate, the Senate distributes power by floor time. And so if you're gonna have 12 bills on the floor, that's 12 appropriations bills and not 12 other bills that may be more visionary solutions, conservative solutions.
Yeah, and I'd point out that when they distribute that power in the Senate, the appropriators tend to be the big spenders, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. So you might get a chance for conservatives to get a third of that airtime, but you've got the Democrats and the appropriators getting 2/3. Nonetheless, we should take use of that third, because we've got powerful arguments, and groups on the outside can be an echo chamber for what the good guys are doing. In the House, the regular order essentially means a return to doing 12 bills. They started to do that last year and stopped part of the way through because of an amendment they were afraid of having a vote on. What they need to do is just make the decision, we're going to go ahead and bring the appropriation bills up one at a time. I also think it means the House has to be willing to say to the Senate, we will not do an omnibus. Now, they're not willing to say that because they're afraid of the shutdown. But if they've passed 12 bills, or even half of them, 6 bills, and the Senate has not passed any, I think they've got to say to them, nonetheless, you have to break down that omnibus into 6 bills, 12 bills, and send them over to us. The reason I think that's important is that then allows a vehicle for conservatives to take a stand on in a veto fight with the president. That's the real driver that people have used to say we need to return to this regular order so that it doesn't become all or nothing, a big omnibus bill at the end of the year.
Yeah, and I think the key is, what are you trying to accomplish with that regular order? Are you trying to cut spending beyond last year, or are you just trying to run through the motions? With that, let's go ahead and open up for questions to the audience. And this gentleman.
Gentlemen, we've all been told for some time that this is the most transparent administration in history. Over the course of the last 2 years, in requesting repeatedly writ of mandamus, I've received recusals from 2 United States magistrates and a district judge, and endless excuses. What do we have to do to actually enforce some genuine responsibility, accountability, and transparency?
Well, one of the things are you use the appropriations process. So have your committees that are doing oversight to reveal this, and they're being stiffed by the Obama administration appointees. Just make it clear, okay, your budget for your agency, if you're not answering the request for information, is going to be cut by 10%. The bureaucrats get that quickly and will insist that there be some answer.
One of the changes that Senator Reid did when he was leader was he shortened the process to confirm nominees and created a unfilibusterable nominations process. Historically, the nominations process has been an opportunity for conservatives to ask questions, to get information, to hold a place on nominees so that more information, documents can be produced. That, I think we should restore that. I think you'd want to have, the nomination process is an important, check and balance for the Senate against an administration that does not want to provide information. And so I would, that's something we should be doing more of.
Other questions? Mr. Gentleman.
Does the leverage point change from shutdown to something else?
Republican president and Republican Congress? Yes. Yeah. In there. Yes, I mean, I think at that point you've got an opportunity to reach an alignment on many more of the big policy questions, and you end up fighting on details. Depending on who the nominee is, you could see a Republican president actually pushing this Congress further to the right than they're comfortable with at this point.
You also have, with a Republican president, no matter who's president, again, the engine of the system is still designed to continue to churn and to grow and expand and reauthorize programs. Even when we had, back when I was working for the steering committee, we had a Republican president, Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican Supreme Court. We still had tons of holds and filibusters on bills that would have grown government. We always need to be mindful that it's the policies and not necessarily the party that governs what we're trying to achieve. But I think the tools that you can use, there are some tools. The budget is a 51 vote threshold and reconciliation. Those are tools that typically will be used when you have that kind of situation.
Yeah, last question. Let's go to
The Pat Span, I'm just wondering, is it just pure volume, or what keeps the members of either house from having their staff keep track of these different bills that are coming out of committees that they're not on? Is it just a pure volume, or do the committees just very protective of what they're doing?
I think it's a combination of both. I think you typically, some of the more experienced members, when we would have hotlines toward the end of the year, the steering committee, the hotline, is how they clear bills. So they'll send a notice out to everybody's phones and emails saying, we're about to ask unanimous consent on a bill. When you get to the last day of the session, they'll hotline hundreds of bills. And those bills have been sitting in a drawer in a committee chairman's office somewhere, and then they unleash, a several hundred-page bill, and hoping that nobody notices. And so that was one of the jobs of the steering committee. We had to review all those things, but the volume is immense, and that's one of the things that most offices, you got junior staffers. They're trying to take care of their boss's mail and vote recommendations. They don't have time to review all this stuff. And so it's really incumbent on us, and to the extent this stuff is public on the grassroots, to be a part of that process. Let
me just add two reflections. Ed's absolutely right about that. Two things I learned when I was up there. One, it takes a group in the House to accomplish what an individual senator can do in the Senate, because you need roughly 25, 30 members to be able to have the same leverage. Second, if you wait until the bill's coming to you on the floor, you'll have no impact. So you've got to prioritize, pick a few things to really dig into. In CATS, what we did was divvied up those so that each of the members of CATS would take different priorities and that they cared about. But if you tried to affect everything, you affected nothing.
Well, thank you for being at this panel. The next one is going to continue on this theme of process as policy with an important conversation about the future of the filibuster. We've got a lot of people on both sides of that, and so stay tuned for that panel. Thank you very much.
We wouldn't let you on that one?